10:47 a.m., the 15th of September, 1940, 8 miles southeast of Dover, above the English Channel. Flight Lieutenant James Mac Macpherson felt his stomach rise into his throat as he pushed the control stick forward, throwing his Spitfire Mark II into a desperate negative G dive. Below him, a Messerschmitt Bf 109 had just slipped beneath his guns, beginning its own diving escape toward the French coast. Mac had perhaps 3 seconds to follow, to get his 8 Browning machine guns on target before the German fighter vanished into the haze at lower altitude. 2 seconds into the dive, it happened. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, that magnificent 12-cylinder symphony that had been roaring at 2,850 revolutions per minute, suddenly coughed, sputtered, then died completely. The silence was obscene. At 18,000 feet, with German fighters swarming the sky and bombers grinding toward London, Mac's Spitfire had become a glider. Fuel, suddenly flooding uncontrolled through the float carburetor under negative gravity, had drowned the engine like a man forced underwater. The propeller windmilled uselessly in the airstream. Below him, the Bf 109 pulled away, its Daimler-Benz fuel-injected engine purring contentedly through any angle of flight, any gravitational force. Mac's hands moved with practiced desperation, throttle back, stick neutral, let positive G-forces return. 1,000 feet lost, 2,000. The engine coughed twice, backfired, then caught again with a bang that shook the entire airframe. By the time the Merlin resumed its roar, the German was gone, and Mac found himself alone, shaking with adrenaline, watching his fuel pressure gauge dance erratically. He would survive this encounter. Flying Officer Peter Pease, diving after a Bf 109 3 days earlier, had not been so fortunate. His engine had cut out at the critical moment, and by the time it restarted, the German pilot had looped back and put a burst of 20mm cannon shells through Pease's cockpit. They found his body 2 days later in a Kent apple orchard, still strapped into his seat. This was the terrible paradox of the early Battle of Britain. British pilots flew the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world, powered by one of engineering's masterpieces, the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, yet they could not pursue enemy aircraft into a dive without their engines dying. It was like sending knights into battle with swords that dissolved the moment they swung downward. The problem was catastrophically simple. The Merlin engine, for all its sophisticated engineering, used a float chamber carburetor, essentially a bowl of fuel with a float valve, not unlike the mechanism in a household toilet. Under positive G-forces, this system worked perfectly. But push the stick forward, subject the engine to negative Gs, and physics became the enemy. Fuel would surge up and flood the carburetor, drowning the engine instantly. German fighters, equipped with fuel injection systems, suffered no such limitation. They could dive, climb, roll, inverted their engines, never missed a beat. The Royal Air Force was losing pilots not to enemy marksmanship, but to gravitational physics. At fighter stations across southern England, pilots developed desperate workarounds. Instead of following Germans into dives, they would half-roll inverted first, then pull back on the stick, maintaining positive Gs throughout the maneuver. But this half-roll and pull technique cost precious seconds, distance, and tactical advantage. By the time a Spitfire pilot completed the maneuver, his target had escaped, or, worse, reversed position for a killing shot. Squadron leader, Sailor Malan described it bitterly in a combat report. "We might as well be fighting with one hand tied behind our backs. The Hun pushes over and dives away. We must roll and pull through. By then he's either gone or coming around on our tail. We're dying because of a carburetor." The Air Ministry knew. Rolls-Royce knew. Teams of their finest engineers had been working on the problem since before the war began. Proposed solutions ranged from completely redesigning the Merlin with fuel injection, a process that would take years, Britain didn't have, to installing pressurized fuel systems that would add weight and complexity to fighters. Needed every advantage in climb and turn performance. By October 1940, with Britain's survival hanging in the balance and pilots dying weekly from engine cutouts, the situation had reached crisis proportions. Group Captain Harry Broadhurst personally flew to the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough with a blunt message. "Fix this, or we lose the war. I don't care if you have to put a bloody cork in it." The Royal Aircraft Establishment, the R.A.E., was Britain's premier aeronautical research facility, where the nation's finest minds wrestled with the mechanical challenges of modern warfare. In its workshops and wind tunnels, A small army of engineers, scientists, and technicians laboured around the clock to solve problems that meant life or death for the young men fighting above Britain's fields and cities. Among them worked someone the RAF pilots would never have expected to be their saviour, a 1-year-old woman who rode a motorcycle to work, held multiple racing records, and possessed an engineer's mind that cut through complexity like a blade through silk. Her name was Beatrice Shilling, though everyone called her Tilly. She had been fighting her own battles long before the war began. Battles against a male-dominated engineering establishment that viewed women as suited for secretarial work, not carburetor design. She had earned her engineering degree from Manchester University as one of only 2 women in her class, then proved herself repeatedly at the R.A.E. through sheer competence and an almost mystical understanding of engine behaviour. When word of the Merlin's fatal flaw reached her department, Tilly Shilling did what she always did. She ignored the committees, the conferences, the elaborate proposed solutions. Instead, she went to her workbench with a simple question that would save hundreds of lives. What, she asked herself, examining a dismantled Merlin carburetor under her lamp, is the smallest possible change that could solve this problem? Beatrice Tilly Shilling approached the dismantled Merlin engine carburetor with the same methodical intensity she brought to everything mechanical. Her colleagues at the R.A.E. had grown accustomed to finding her in the workshop at odd hours, oil-stained and absorbed, talking to engines as if they were puzzle boxes that might reveal their secrets through patient interrogation. She had earned this reputation through years of proving herself in spaces where women simply didn't belong, or so she had been told repeatedly. At Manchester University in 1932, when she'd walked into her first engineering lecture, the professor had stopped mid-sentence and asked if she was lost. "The secretarial school is in the adjacent building, miss." She had replied by taking a seat in the front row and achieving the highest marks in thermodynamics that semester. Her mere presence at the R.A.E. represented a minor miracle of bureaucratic oversight. The establishment had hired her in 1936 almost by accident. Her application listed only B. Shilling, and the selection committee assumed the exceptional credentials belonged to a man. By the time they discovered their error, she had already solved a persistent valve timing problem that had stumped the senior staff for months. The workshop where she now studied the Merlin's carburetor was her domain. Unlike the theoretical abstractions preferred by many engineers, Tilly believed in what she called symptomatic reasoning, understanding not just how machines should work, but how they actually failed. She had spent weeks interviewing returned pilots, many of them boys barely out of school, their hands still trembling as they described the horrifying moment when their engines died in combat. "It's not a gradual failure," Flying Officer Tommy Thompson had told her, his eyes focused somewhere beyond the workshop wall. "One moment you have power, the next nothing. Like someone's thrown a switch, and Jerry knows it. The moment they see us trying to half-roll instead of diving, they know we're helpless for those few seconds. That's when they kill us." The technical problem, as Tilly mapped it out on her workbench, was elegantly horrible in its simplicity. The SU carburetor used in the Merlin operated on a float system. Under normal conditions, fuel entered a chamber where a brass float, not unlike those in a lavatory cistern, regulated the flow. When the float rose with the fuel level, it closed a needle valve, stopping flow. When the level dropped as the engine consumed fuel, the float fell, opening the valve again. Simple, reliable, proven. But under negative g-forces, physics inverted, the float, suddenly lighter than the fuel around it, would drop to what was now effectively the top of the chamber. This opened the needle valve completely, flooding the engine with fuel far more than it could burn. The spark plugs fouled instantly, combustion ceased, and 12 cylinders of precisely machined aluminum and steel became dead weight. The Rolls-Royce engineers had proposed replacing the entire system with the Bendix-Stromberg pressure carburetor used by the Americans, or developing a fuel injection system like the Germans used. Both solutions would work, certainly. But Tilly calculated the time required. 18 months minimum for design, testing, and retrofit of the entire fighter fleet. Britain might not survive 18 weeks at the current loss rate. "You're not seriously suggesting you can solve this?" Gerald Patterson, one of the senior engineers, had said when Tilly presented her initial analysis at the morning briefing. "Rolls-Royce has their best minds on it. Derby has been working on fuel injection prototypes for 2 years. And in 2 more years, they'll have a perfect solution." Tilly replied, not looking up from her calculations. But perfect is the enemy of good enough. The pilots need something now, not a masterpiece of engineering delivered posthumously. Patterson's face had reddened. This isn't motorcycle racing, Miss Shilling. We're talking about combat aircraft engines operating at the very edge of mechanical possibility. One mistake and pilots die. Pilots are already dying, she shot back, finally meeting his gaze. 3 this week from engine cutouts alone. How many more while we wait for perfection? The exchange had ended with Patterson storming out, but Tilly had received unexpected support from an unlikely source. Wing Commander Taffy Jones, a Great War ace now serving as liaison between the R.A.E. and Fighter Command, had stayed behind after the meeting. "Show me what you're thinking," he said simply. Tilly had spread her diagrams across the table. Her solution was almost insultingly simple. A small brass restrictor plate with a carefully calibrated orifice, a hole that would limit fuel flow just enough to prevent flooding under negative Gs, but not so much as to starve the engine under normal operation. "It's essentially a washer," she explained, "a precisely machined washer that fits in the fuel line. The orifice diameter is critical too small, and we restrict normal operation, too large, and we don't solve the problem. But if we get it right, it's a 5-minute installation that requires no modification to the engine itself." Jones had studied the drawings with the eye of someone who had survived 57 combat missions through mechanical reliability. "The Rolls-Royce engineers will say it's too simple, that it can't possibly work." "The Rolls-Royce engineers," Tilly replied, "aren't watching 19-year-old boys fall out of the sky because their engines cut out. The first restrictor plate, she refused to call it anything more grandiose, was machined that afternoon in the R.A.E. workshop, brass. Precisely 0.3 inches in diameter at its orifice, small enough to fit on a fingertip. To look at it was to see nothing remarkable. A small metal disc with a hole in the center, like a mechanical thimble or a very small washer. The workshop technicians who helped manufacture it nicknamed it Tilly's thimble, though Tilly herself preferred the technical designation, R.A.E. restrictor, Type 1. The first test came 3 days later. A Merlin 3 engine, mounted on a test bed, with recording equipment attached to measure fuel flow, pressure, and combustion stability. Tilly insisted on operating the controls herself, despite regulations requiring a certified test engineer for all power unit trials. "Start the engine," she ordered. The Merlin roared to life, 12 cylinders firing in sequence, producing their characteristic smooth thunder, oil pressure steady, temperature nominal. Fuel flow consistent at 88 gallons per hour at maximum continuous power. "Initiating negative G simulation," Tilly announced, pulling the lever that would invert the test rig, subjecting the engine to the same forces that plagued pilots in combat dives. Without the restrictor, the engine would have died instantly. With Tilly's simple brass disc installed, the Merlin coughed once a single hesitation, like a man clearing his throat, then continued running. Fuel flow had spiked momentarily to 97 gallons per hour, then stabilized at 91. Not perfect, but functional. The engine kept running. "Again," Tilly ordered. "Maximum negative loading." They ran the test 17 times that afternoon. 17 times the engine survived what would have killed it before. The restrictor plate, that stupid little thimble, as Patterson had dismissively called it, had solved in 3 days what Rolls-Royce had struggled with for 2 years. But the real test would not come in a workshop. It would come at 20,000 feet, with Messerschmitts on a pilot's tail and London burning below. The question was whether Fighter Command would trust a solution devised by a woman who had never flown a combat mission, never designed an aircraft engine, and whose greatest prior achievement involved making motorcycles run faster around the Brooklands circuit. The conference room at the Air Ministry building in London still showed scars from the September bombings, hastily patched ceiling plaster, and windows replaced with boards. On the 23rd of October 1940, the room held a gathering that would determine whether Tilly Shilling's restrictor would ever see combat. Air Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding sat at the head of the table, his gaunt face showing the exhaustion of commanding Fighter Command through the worst of the Battle of Britain. Around him sat representatives from Rolls-Royce, the Air Ministry's technical staff, and 3 operational squadron leaders who had lost pilots to engine failures. Tilly stood at the presentation board, the only woman in a room of 32 men. In her hand, she held one of the brass restrictors so small it was nearly invisible from the back of the room. "Gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying the Yorkshire accent she had never bothered to soften. This device has successfully prevented engine cutout in 17 consecutive negative G tests at Farnborough. Installation takes less than 5 minutes. Cost per unit is approximately 3 shillings. We can begin fitting squadrons immediately. Sir Stanley Hooker, representing Rolls-Royce, leaned forward. He was the company's chief carburetor designer, a man whose reputation rested on the Merlin's performance. Miss Shilling, with respect, you're asking us to trust the lives of our pilots to what is essentially a brass washer. The Merlin engine represents 5 years of development, thousands of hours of testing. You've had 3 days. 3 days to solve a problem that's existed for 5 years, Tilly replied evenly. How many more pilots should we lose while waiting for a perfect solution? Squadron leader Douglas Bader, who had lost both legs in a pre-war crash and still flew combat missions on prosthetics, interrupted with characteristic bluntness. I don't give a damn if it's a brass washer or a bloody cork. Does it work? The ground tests indicate, Hooker began, but Bader cut him off. Ground tests mean nothing. I need to know if it works when I'm diving after a 109 with tracers going past my head. Dowding raised a hand for silence. Miss Shilling, you're asking me to modify every Merlin engine in Fighter Command based on a workshop test. If this fails, if engines start cutting out completely or running lean and seizing, we could lose our entire defensive capability in days. Tilly met his gaze directly. Then test it in combat conditions first. 1 aircraft, 1 volunteer pilot. Let them put it through everything the Germans force them to do. If it fails, you've lost nothing but 3 shillings of brass. And potentially 1 pilot, Dowding noted. Sir, you're losing pilots every day to the existing problem. This offers a chance to stop those losses. The room fell silent. Finally, Squadron Leader John Cat's Eyes, Cunningham spoke up. I'll test it. Hooker protested immediately. This is absurd. We're discussing a field modification that hasn't been through proper channels, hasn't been tested at altitude, hasn't been evaluated for long-term effects on engine wear. Mr. Hooker, Dowding interrupted, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had held the line against the Luftwaffe. How long would your proper channels take? To do it correctly? 6 to 8 months minimum. Then we test Miss Shilling's device tomorrow. Dowding stood. If it works, we begin immediate production. If it fails, Rolls-Royce continues their development and Miss Shilling returns to whatever she was working on before. The next morning, October 24, dawned clear and cold at RAF Tangmere. Cunningham's Spitfire, serial number P7350, sat on the flight line with a small crowd gathered around it. Word had spread that some boffin gadget was being tested, and pilots from 3 squadrons had found excuses to watch. Tilly herself supervised the installation, her small hands working inside the engine cowling alongside the squadron mechanic. The restrictor plate fit perfectly into the fuel line, held in place by the standard coupling. 5 minutes and 14 seconds from start to finish. That's it? The mechanic asked, incredulous. That little thing is supposed to fix the cutout problem? We'll find out, Tilly replied, wiping her hands on a rag. She turned to Cunningham, who was already wearing his flight gear. Put it through everything. Every maneuver that's killed an engine before. Cunningham nodded and climbed into the cockpit. The Merlin started normally, its 12 cylinders settling into their familiar rhythm. He taxied out, ran through his checks, then opened the throttle. The Spitfire leaped forward, airborne in seconds, climbing steeply into the morning sky. From the ground, they watched him climb to 15,000 feet, a tiny silver cross against the blue. Then he dove. It was a brutal vertical plunge, the kind that would have killed the engine instantly without the restrictor. The Spitfire fell like a thrown dart, engine note changing from roar to scream as it exceeded 400 miles per hour. Those watching held their breath, waiting for the telltale silence that would indicate engine failure. It never came. Cunningham pulled out at 5,000 feet, the Spitfire's elliptical wings bending visibly under the G-forces, then immediately pushed over into another negative G dive. Again, the engine kept running. He performed 7 more violent maneuvers, bunts, outside loops, inverted dives that would have killed an unmodified Merlin instantly. When he landed 23 minutes later, the first thing he said as he climbed from the cockpit was, But the real test came 6 days later, over the Thames estuary. Flight Lieutenant Eric Locke, flying with 611 Squadron, had been one of the first operational pilots fitted with what was already being called Miss Shilling's orifice, a name that made Tilly cringe, but had been adopted with enthusiastic vulgarity by the squadrons. On October 30, his flight intercepted a formation of Bf 109 seconds, escorting Junkers 88 bombers heading for London. Locke's combat report, filed that evening, provided the proof Dowding needed. Engaged enemy fighters at 22,000 feet, 109 attempted to escape by diving vertically, followed him down, pushed straight over, no half roll. Engine coughed once but kept running. Maintained pursuit through 6,000 feet of vertical dive. Engine never cut. Closed to 150 yards and fired 3-second burst. 109 broke apart. Pilot did not escape. This would have been impossible without the modification. The Jerry clearly expected my engine to quit. It didn't. Within hours of Locke's report reaching Fighter Command headquarters, Dowding issued Emergency Technical Order 1940/713. All Merlin engines in Fighter Command to be fitted with R.A.E. restrictors immediately. Priority 1. The workshops at every fighter station in Britain began working around the clock. Tilly herself, along with a team of technicians she had trained, travelled from base to base, supervising installations and teaching squadron mechanics the precise procedure. At each station, she was met with the same mixture of skepticism and desperate hope. At Biggin Hill, she encountered a young pilot officer named Geoffrey Page, his face still showing burn scars from a previous bailout. "Is it true?" he asked her directly. "This thing really lets us dive after them?" "It's not perfect," Tilly admitted, checking the installation on his aircraft personally. "You'll get a momentary hesitation, maybe a backfire, but the engine won't quit. You can follow them down." Page studied her for a moment. "You know you're saving our lives with this thing? This stupid little brass washer?" "It's not stupid if it works," Tilly replied, but her voice carried something that might have been pride. Within 2 weeks, every operational Spitfire and Hurricane in Fighter Command had been modified. The installation statistics were remarkable. 1,000 aircraft modified, total cost under £150, average installation time 6 minutes. Rolls-Royce, meanwhile, estimated their fuel injection solution was still 18 months from production. The effect on combat effectiveness was immediate and dramatic. RAF pilots could now pursue diving enemy aircraft without the deadly half-roll maneuver. Kill ratios improved overnight. More importantly, German pilots lost a critical tactical advantage they had exploited since the war's beginning. But for Tilly Shilling, standing in a freezing hangar at Hornchurch at 2 a.m, supervising the last of the installations, the victory felt incomplete. The restrictor was a bandage, not a cure. It solved the immediate problem, but didn't address the fundamental limitation of the float carburetor design. "It's not enough," she said to her assistant, Margaret Robotham, one of the few other women working at R.A.E. "We need a better solution, a permanent one." "Tilly," Margaret replied, watching exhausted mechanics work by lamplight to install another restrictor. "You've just saved Fighter Command. Maybe that's enough for 1 week?" The first German intelligence report noting the change appeared on the 12th of November 1940 in a Luftwaffe tactical assessment. Enemy pursuit tactics have altered significantly. Spitfires now follow our fighters through negative G maneuvers without engine failure. Defensive diving no longer guarantees escape. Losses have increased accordingly. Major Adolf Galland, one of Germany's leading aces, would later write in his memoirs about the sudden shift. "It was as if the British pilots had learned to fly overnight. We had relied on their engine weakness for months, diving away when threatened, knowing they couldn't follow. Then, suddenly, in early November, they could. We lost 12 experienced pilots in 10 days before we understood what had changed. The mathematics of air combat had been rewritten by a piece of brass the size of a sixpence. But for Tilly Shilling, working 18-hour days between Farnborough and the fighter stations, the human cost of even this success was becoming visible in ways statistics couldn't capture. At RAF Kenley, she encountered Pilot Officer Richard Hillary, whose hands were still bandaged from burns, suffered when his previous Spitfire had been shot down. He'd been unable to escape a diving Bf 109 due to engine cutout. Now, Watching Tilly install a restrictor in his replacement aircraft, he spoke with the bitter humour that had become the pilot's shield against fear. "So you're the woman who's made us all equal opportunity targets again," he said. "The Germans must hate you." "They don't know I exist," Tilly replied, checking the fuel line connection with a torch. "As far as anyone outside Fighter Command knows, this is just a standard Rolls-Royce modification. That's rather unfair, isn't it? Them getting the credit?" Tilly paused in her work. "Mr. Hillary, I don't need credit. I need you and every other pilot to come home alive. That's the only metric that matters." But coming home alive had taken on new dimensions. With the restrictor installed, RAF pilots were pursuing enemies more aggressively, following them through maneuvers that would have been suicidal weeks earlier. The kill rates improved, but so did the intensity of combat. Pilots were pushing deeper into enemy formations, staying in fights longer, taking risks that their newly reliable engines now permitted. Squadron leader Peter Townsend, commanding 85 Squadron, noted in his November diary, "The modification has made us deadlier, but also more reckless. Yesterday, Sergeant Morris followed a 109 through such a violent dive that his aircraft's wings showed permanent deformation upon landing. When I asked why he'd pushed so hard, he simply said, 'Because now I could, sir.' The restrictor's success had created an unexpected problem. Pilots needed retraining to utilize their aircraft's restored capability. Many had spent months developing tactics around the engine limitation, and sudden freedom required adjustment. 3 Hurricanes were lost in the first week after modification, not to enemy action but to pilots exceeding structural limits in pursuits that would have been impossible before. Tilly found herself writing supplementary technical notes that became required reading at fighter stations. The restrictor prevents engine cutout. It does not suspend the laws of physics or structural engineering. Aircraft still have limitations. Pilots must remember they are flying aluminum and steel, not immortal chariots. Meanwhile, at Rolls-Royce's Derby facility, the reaction to the restrictor's success was complex. Sir Stanley Hooker, who had initially opposed Tilly's solution, now found himself in the uncomfortable position of explaining to his board of directors why a woman with no aero engine experience had solved in days what his team hadn't fixed in years. "It's a temporary solution," he insisted at a November 20 board meeting. "Crude, but effective. Our fuel injection system, when complete, will be far superior." "When complete," Lord Hives, managing director of Rolls-Royce, replied dryly, "appears to be some time after the war's end. Meanwhile, Miss Shilling's crude device is saving pilots daily. Perhaps we should consider hiring her." The suggestion was made partly in jest, but it highlighted an uncomfortable truth spreading through Britain's technical establishment. The war was being won not by elaborate engineering perfection, but by practical innovation under pressure. Tilly Shilling represented something new and unsettling: competence without pedigree, solutions without committees, engineering stripped to its essential purpose. By December 1940, the restrictor had been installed in over 2,000 aircraft. The RAF's tactical options had expanded dramatically. Formation leaders could order pursuit dives without hesitation. Bomber interception rates improved by 30%. The Luftwaffe was forced to develop new defensive tactics, assigning additional fighters to protection duties that had previously been unnecessary. But for Tilly, the greatest validation came from an unexpected source. On December 15, she received a package at Farnborough with no return address. Inside was a small piece of aluminum, clearly torn from an aircraft, with German text stamped on one side. On the reverse, someone had scratched in English, "Shot down December 12. Your gadget let me follow him down." He never expected it. "Thank you, a grateful pilot." She never learned who sent it, but she kept that piece of aluminum on her workbench for the rest of the war. The restrictor's impact extended beyond combat effectiveness. It had demonstrated that innovation could come from unexpected sources, that the established hierarchies of technical expertise might be excluding crucial voices. The Air Ministry, impressed by the rapid success, authorized the creation of a new rapid prototype unit at R.A.E., with Tilly appointed as lead engineer, the first woman to hold such a position. Not everyone celebrated this appointment. Gerald Patterson, the senior engineer who had dismissed her initial proposal, requested a transfer rather than report to a woman. Others grumbled about wartime necessities and temporary arrangements, but results spoke louder than prejudice. Under Tilly's direction, The rapid prototype unit would go on to develop 17 other modifications that improved aircraft survivability, each one following her philosophy: simple, practical, immediate. Yet, even as her restrictor saved lives daily, Tilly was already working on its replacement. The restrictor was, as she had always known, a stopgap measure. It prevented flooding, but at the cost of slightly reduced fuel flow. In extended negative G maneuvers, engines could still run rough. Pilots had adapted, but adaptation meant compromise. In her workshop notes dated the 18th of December 1940, she wrote, "The restrictor has bought us time, nothing more. Every pilot flying with it deserves better, deserves an engine that performs perfectly regardless of attitude or acceleration. The Germans have this. The Americans are developing it. We cannot remain satisfied with good enough when perfection is achievable. This drive for improvement, even in the face of success, would define the next phase of her war effort." But first, there was Christmas, 1940 to survive. A Christmas when London burned nightly, when the outcome of the war remained desperately uncertain, and when young men in Spitfires and Hurricanes continued to climb into winter skies, their engines kept alive by a small brass disc that nobody had expected to work. On Christmas Eve, Tilly received an official memorandum from Fighter Command Headquarters. It was not a commendation or a thank you, but something perhaps more valuable, a statistical summary. Since the restrictor's introduction, engine failure-related combat losses had dropped by 78%. In raw numbers, that translated to approximately 45 pilots who had returned from missions that would likely have killed them without the modification. 45 families who would have their sons, husbands, and fathers home for Christmas, even if home was a dispersal hut at a bomber-threatened airfield. 45 young men who would see another dawn, fight another day, because a female engineer had refused to accept that the problem was too complex for a simple solution. Tilly spent that Christmas Eve in her workshop, designing the next iteration of the restrictor, one that would allow variable flow based on G-forces. Around her, the war continued its relentless consumption of youth and machinery. But in the small circle of her lamplight, surrounded by brass shavings and technical drawings, she continued what she had always done, making machines work better, making survival more likely, engineering hope from metal and mathematics. The war did not end with the Battle of Britain, nor did Tilly Shilling's restrictor remain the final solution to the Merlin's fuel problem. By spring 1941, as the Luftwaffe shifted its attention eastward toward the Soviet Union, Rolls-Royce had finally developed the Bendix-Stromberg pressure carburetor that would eventually replace Tilly's brass disc. But by then, her temporary solution had been operating in combat aircraft for 6 crucial months, when Britain's survival balanced on the thinnest edge. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, writing in his post-war memoirs, would calculate that the restrictor had prevented approximately 200 engine failure-related losses between November 1940 and May 1941. "In a battle where we were losing pilots faster than we could train them," he wrote, "Miss Shilling's device didn't just save aircraft, it preserved the seed corn of Fighter Command's future. But numbers tell only part of the story." Squadron leader James McPherson, the pilot whose engine failure over the Channel had opened this history, survived the war to become an airline captain. In 1965, he tracked down Tilly Shilling, by then working on rocket engine cooling systems for the Blue Streak missile program. Their meeting, at a London hotel bar, was brief but poignant. "I wanted to thank you," he said simply. "Your restrictor saved my life at least 3 times, probably more." "You saved your own life," Tilly replied, uncomfortable as always with personal recognition. "I just prevented the engine from making it harder." "No," McPherson insisted. "You gave us equality in the air. Before your modification, we were fighting with a handicap. After it, we could match them move for move. That psychological edge, knowing we could follow them anywhere, it changed everything." The restrictor's influence extended far beyond its mechanical function. Its rapid development and deployment had demonstrated that Britain's survival might depend not on grand strategies or wonder weapons, but on countless small innovations implemented quickly by people working outside traditional hierarchies. The modification cost less than £200 total to implement across the entire fighter fleet, less than the cost of a single aircraft engine. yet its tactical impact equaled that of deploying an entire new squadron. More significantly, Tilly Shilling's success had cracked open doors previously sealed against women in technical fields. The Society of Women Engineers, founded in 1919 but largely ceremonial before the war, saw its membership triple between 1941 and 1945. Young women who might have become teachers or secretaries instead pursued engineering degrees, citing Miss Shilling's orifice as proof that gender was irrelevant to technical competence. Margaret Robotham, Tilly's assistant at R.A.E., would go on to lead the development of ejection seats for jet aircraft. Dorothy Spicer, inspired by newspaper accounts of the restrictor's success, became Britain's first female aeronautical engineer at Hawker Aircraft. By 1960, over 400 women worked in British aerospace engineering, still a tiny minority, but infinitely more than the handful who had preceded Tilly. Yet for all her influence, Tilly Shilling remained remarkably unchanged by fame. She continued riding her motorcycle to work, continued speaking with characteristic bluntness at technical meetings, continued solving problems with the same methodical intensity. When offered an OBE in 1948 for her wartime service, she initially declined, arguing that hundreds of people contributed to keeping those aircraft flying. She accepted only when officials pointed out that refusing would diminish recognition for women's technical contributions during the war. The restrictor itself remained in service far longer than anyone anticipated. Even after pressure carburetors became standard, many pilots requested that the restrictors remain installed as backup protection. They had become talismans, tiny brass guarantees against the sudden silence that had killed so many early in the war. When Spitfire P-7350, Cunningham's aircraft that had first tested the device, was restored in 1990, the restrictor was still in place, tarnished but intact. In 1969, at a dinner commemorating the Battle of Britain's 29th anniversary, Adolf Galland met Tilly Shilling for the first and only time. The former enemies, now elderly, discussed the technical evolution of fighter aircraft over brandy. When Galland learned that the woman across from him had designed the modification that had eliminated his pilot's crucial advantage, he raised his glass with a rueful smile. "So, you're the one," he said. "We wondered what had changed. Our technical intelligence was convinced Rolls-Royce had achieved some breakthrough in carburetor design. We spent months trying to steal the plans." "There were no plans worth stealing," Tilly replied. "Just a brass washer with a hole in it." Galland laughed. "The best solutions usually are that simple. We Germans, we over-engineer everything. You British muddle through with brass washers and somehow win wars." But perhaps the most telling testament to the restrictor's importance came from an unexpected source. In 1985, Soviet aerospace historian Viktor Kulikov published a study of decisive small innovations in aerial warfare. He calculated that Tilly's restrictor, by enabling RAF pilots to pursue and destroy German fighters more effectively during the Battle of Britain's critical phase, had prevented the Luftwaffe from achieving the air superiority necessary for Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain. Had this modification been delayed by even 2 months, Kulikov wrote, the mathematics of attrition would have favoured the Luftwaffe. Britain might have been forced to negotiate, America would have lost its forward base for European operations, and the Soviet Union would have faced Germany alone. The entire tide of the war pivoted on a piece of brass smaller than a coin. Beatrice Tilly Shilling died on the 18th of November 1990 at the age of 81. She had spent her post-war career pushing the boundaries of engineering, working on everything from rocket engines to racing car superchargers. But she always returned to the fundamental principle that had guided her solution to the Merlin's fatal flaw. The best engineering serves immediate human needs, with elegant simplicity. At her funeral, attended by surviving Battle of Britain pilots, R.A.E. engineers, and 3 generations of women who had followed her into technical careers, Wing Commander Paul Farnes delivered the eulogy. Farnes, one of the last surviving pilots who had flown with the restrictor, concluded with words that captured both the innovation and the innovator. Tilly Shilling saved lives with 3 shillings worth of brass, and an unwillingness to accept that problems must be complex simply because they affect complex machines. She proved that genius isn't about credentials or conventions, it's about seeing the obvious solution that expertise has trained everyone else to overlook. Every Spitfire pilot who came home because his engine didn't quit owes that homecoming to a woman who was told repeatedly that she didn't belong in an engineering workshop. Today, one of Tilley's original restrictors sits in the Science Museum in London, displayed beside a Merlin engine. The label reads simply, R.A.E. restrictor 1940. Designer, B. Shilling. Thousands pass it daily, most without stopping, unaware that this tiny brass disc, this stupid little thimble, helped determine whether their grandparents would grow up speaking English or German. But for those who know the story, that small piece of metal represents something profound: the power of practical innovation over elaborate planning, the victory of function over form, and the proof that salvation sometimes comes not from the expected sources, but from those whom society has overlooked. In war, as in engineering, the smallest modifications can produce the greatest changes. The Battle of Britain was won by courage, by radar, by strategy, and by sacrifice. But it was also won by a brass washer with a precisely machined hole, designed by a woman who rode a motorcycle, spoke her mind without apology, and understood that in the seconds when an engine stutters at 20,000 feet, elegance matters less than reliability. In those desperate months of 1940, when civilization's fate hung on the performance of a few thousand young men in aluminum aircraft, Beatrice Shilling gave them what they needed most: engines that wouldn't quit when they pushed forward on the stick. She gave them equality in the air. She gave them a fighting chance. And with 3 shillings worth of brass, she helped save the world.